Hello, welcome. Thank you for clicking through to this video on how a Venturi works on a 2-stroke or a 4-stroke carburettor. They're pretty similar and they're very basic models I'm using, so I'm hoping I can explain my point there. This is how this system works to the best of my knowledge and beliefs over the 25 years plus I've been working on these carburettors. And I'll go ahead now, and what I'll do is I'll explain the 2-stroke first and then the 4-stroke. You'll see that there's two examples. So far we've had the choke butterfly closed, causing a restriction here of the air, making a greater vacuum inside there to draw out more fuel. And that of course is what we really needed to get the engine going from a cold start initially. But now we've got combustion occurring and the engine's warming up, we no longer need that high amount of fuel, because if we carry on using that amount of fuel, it will indeed be detrimental to the engine, because it will flood the engine with too much fuel, because a warmer engine doesn't need this amount of fuel. So here we'll show now that the butterfly's open. And all that restricted air now was drawn in through the carb and reduces that level of vacuum that was there when the restriction was there. That of course means that there isn't such a high amount of fuel being drawn out of the main jet now, and the air that's come into the inlet here has mixed well with the fuel. And at the moment it might look like there isn't enough fuel coming out the main jet in consideration to how much air is coming into the inlet. But that's where this very special restriction down here in the inlet comes into play. What happened was that as soon as that choke butterfly was opened and that mass amount of air rushed right into the induction tube there, it took up all that space inside the induction tube because it all wanted to flow down it. That meant that as soon as it hit this restriction here, it would slow down and back up behind it. And that's because that amount of high volume of air travelling at that speed, such a high speed, would have trouble getting through it quick enough. Of course, this again is another air restriction that we have here in the inlet. The first one, of course, was the choke, as we saw, and we saw that an increase of vacuum built up inside the inlet because of it. But now, with this restriction here, the vacuum is building up around this restriction and in the inlet tube after it. And that means that a high amount of vacuum is building up in this area here, and that vacuum is pulling through some of that air, and what air actually does come through that restriction is moving incredibly fast, faster than it ever was before. And so some people refer to this air as being responsible for dragging out that fuel out of the main jet, but it's more likely to be the fact that because there's a massive amount of vacuum building up there because of that restriction, it's more likely to be that it's that vacuum pulling that fuel out of there, but the right amount of fuel this time for the right amount of air that's coming through that restriction for the engine to run correctly. And let's just remember what's causing that vacuum. It's the piston on the induction stroke which is lowering. And the situation we're at with the 4-stroke here is similar to how it was with the 2-stroke on the last induction. What we've got here is that high amount of fuel still coming from here because we've got the choke still closed, and that means we've got all that vacuum in there drawing that fuel out the main jet. But what's happening now is that because the engine has actually undertaken a power stroke with combustion, so it started to combust the fuel, we're now going to open that butterfly there. So we're going to open that choke butterfly, and that will allow in an influx of all of that air that really wants to come into that inlet area there. And pretty much the same as the 2-stroke carb, this air all rushes in and fills all of this space inside the induction tube, and then it comes up against the restriction again here, so it's going into the Venturi here. And then what's happening again is that because there's such a lot amount of air there and there's a lot of suction pressure from the piston going down on the induction stroke, all of that air that wants to travel down the induction tube gets backed up there at the restriction, just the same as the 2-stroke. And again, the piston lowering creates a high vacuum here because of that restriction. And what air does come through that restriction is moving really, really fast, faster than any other air in here. And of course, that build-up of vacuum in there is drawing on the jet again. But because we've got a certain amount of air coming through here and at high speed, it mixes with this fuel as it does with the 2-stroke, and it draws it all in towards the engine. It's actually the right amount of air to fuel mixture at this stage, as I said before. And something I haven't mentioned yet, which is quite important, is that this restriction is obviously, as we've mentioned, important to create that vacuum inside there in order to draw on the jet, but also it purposely allows that air, what air can come through the restriction, allows that to speed up purposely, so it hits that fuel hard as it's coming out the jet, so that it, what we call, atomizes the fuel. It mixes it with the air in just the right way to allow combustion to occur, as otherwise any neat fuel going in there without any air mixed with it won't really combust as well, if at all. We open up the throttle butterflies, and that allows all of that air and fuel to come in much quicker and more efficiently, and that raises the RPM of the engine. Okay, thank you for watching this particular video, and I really hope it's helped. And if you know anybody who might benefit from this kind of content, then please do share and click the like button. And if you haven't already, please subscribe. Thank you very much.